Hi, I'm Phil Jump, NWBA Regional Minister, and welcome to another of our online reflections. When I was coming toward the end of my teenage years, whenever I complained about anything, my dad would often come out with a very familiar refrain. When I was your age, I was fighting for my king and country, which is kind of true, although in reality my dad's war service never quite took him past the stores department at Stirling Castle. And sometimes my mum would join in and remind me of how she'd been evacuated during the air raids in our city of Liverpool. And of course, for both of them, that time of life was a tough time. And I know that for many people of my generation, that kind of narrative of "you don't know you're born" became something of a cliche, as we did enjoy the benefits and the opportunities that our parents saw themselves as having secured for us. And I'd sometimes have a little go back at my dad and say, well, if you fought so hard for me to have it, why on earth begrudge it? But like I said, I'm not sure that we really quite understood what they'd been through, or maybe took those comments as seriously as we should. But I've thought a lot about those conversations in recent days. Not because I'm looking to push the connections between coronavirus and the war years too far. But what I have particularly realised is how, for the best part of 70 years now, we have pretty much taken peace and stability for granted. And what's happened in recent months, as well as being a direct tragedy and struggle for many, has caused a level of disruption to our routines that probably hasn't been experienced since those days of the Second World War, when my dad was hitting his late teens and early 20s. And not only are we not used to that level of disruption, unlike many people in parts of the world, but we've almost come to see the stability and security as a right rather than a privilege for which we should be thankful. So yeah, we struggle to cope when the benefits of that stability are suddenly denied us. But as I've thought about that, I've also come to realise, in a way that I'd probably never fully noticed before, just how much of the narrative of our scriptures emerges from situations of disruption and uncertainty. And not only that, but I've noticed how we then manage to turn those very narratives of disruption into the symbols of our own certainty. So, for example, one of the big narratives that's circulating in our society at the moment is, what about Christmas? Can we seriously expect university students to remain in their halls of residence over the festive season? Are we really not going to be allowed to visit our families and relatives in their homes? And in our churches, we are struggling to countenance Christmas without our usual programme of celebrations and carol services, because these things have become the certainties and the routines that define us. And yeah, we may be willing to cope with a few restrictions and social distances on a day-to-day basis, but surely these things are unassailable. We can't do without them. And I've got to be honest and say, this is not a struggle that I'm somehow removed from. My life and expectations are defined by the very same things. But as I reflect on that, I cannot help but see something of an irony, for the very event that we are so alarmed at being disrupted was a monumental upheaval for those who were part of it. I mean, the whole birth in a stable thing represents a measure of turmoil for Mary and Joseph and others who were part of it that is beyond the scale of what most of us are experiencing through coronavirus restrictions. Anyway, let's save Christmas for Christmas. Like I said, it's just one example of a biblical narrative that navigates its way through all kinds of disruptions and upheavals. And I want to concentrate on another episode from a much earlier part in the history of God's people, when again their entire nation's life had been completely uprooted and thrown into disarray. Their land had been invaded, their homes and their cities had been destroyed, and many of their political and religious leaders, along with the craftspeople and the entrepreneurs, had been marched into exile in Babylon. And one of those people was a guy called Daniel, whose story is told in an Old Testament book that bears his name. And I'm just going to read a short excerpt from his story that we find in chapter 6. And before we do that, I probably need to set the scene a little bit. Daniel had arrived as an imprisoned exile in Babylon as a young man. And the idea of the king at the time was to identify individuals of promise and allow them to hold reasonably high office. That way he always had control, because as technically they were still foreign exiles who could be dispensed with in a moment. But it also meant that they could then kind of act as advocates for his regime to their own people, and therefore create a fair measure of social and political stability. And Daniel had risen through the ranks. He was pretty uncompromising in his religious commitments and observances, but that had actually pretty much served to impress the various monarchs who then came and went. And eventually, during the reign of King Darius, he sets up a political order with 120 provincial rulers, over which 3 chief ministers had oversight, and Daniel was one of those 3. And he so distinguished himself in that role that the king had in mind to make him the senior over the lot. But this generates significant jealousy amongst some of the others, who couldn't forget that Daniel was really just an enslaved exile. So they decide to use his religious observance as a trap. They go to the king and they get him to make a binding decree that only the king himself should be honoured and worshipped for 30 days. And we pick the story up in verse 10 of chapter 6 of the book of Daniel, which I'm going to read. Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room, where the windows opened towards Jerusalem, and 3 times a day he came to his knees and prayed, giving thanks to God just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So they went to the king and spoke to him about the decree. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days anyone who prays to any god or man except to you, O king, would be thrown into the lion's den? And the king answered, the decree stands in accordance with the laws of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. And then they said to the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the decree that you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. And when the king heard this, he was greatly distressed, and he was determined to rescue Daniel, and made every effort until sundown to save him. Now, the first thing that I want us to notice as we focus on this is that Daniel's part of a big story, and this is only a short reflection, so we need to just kind of look at some of the smaller details. And one of those is Daniel's rhythm and routine. I remember learning a song when I was a child that spoke of Daniel as a man of prayer who daily prayed 3 times. And as I've reflected on that, I've kind of realised that although this rhythm of facing his home city of Jerusalem and praying 3 times a day was something that he did quite regularly, he probably only started doing that once he'd been uprooted and exiled. After all, as a young man, he wouldn't have needed to face Jerusalem to pray because he lived there. Daniel had needed to adjust his routine and rhythm to embrace a whole new set of circumstances. And we can soon pick up from many of the other stories in the book of Daniel that his faith and the presence of God in this new place became a very real part of his life and experience when he was in Babylon. There were those who could only yearn and pine to be taken back to Jerusalem, but Daniel embraced a very different agenda. His prayer that day was in response to real life issues, not nostalgic sentiment. His concern was not how he could go back to Jerusalem, but how he could bring everything that Jerusalem represented into the heart of the here and now. Now, Daniel's story is pretty remarkable. There are miracles, visions and dreams, and he had a pretty senior office in the court of a king. That's not going to be the experience of most of us. But I would argue that whatever the circumstances we find ourselves in, that basic dynamic that defined Daniel's life is one that we can and we should try to repeat. Our calling right now is not to work out how we can restore the expressions of faith we once had. but how we can bring the narratives and values of our faith into the here and now. Yeah, Daniel recognized that this meant physically pointing himself toward Jerusalem, but this was merely an outward reminder of an inner commitment to center his life and his decision making, to allow his responses to be defined by nothing else but the faith that in turn defined him. And let's be clear, this was not religious escapism. As we've already noticed, this all came about because Daniel was about to be appointed to the most senior official in the kingdom outside of the royal family. He wasn't praying to somehow distance himself from what was going on around him. He was praying because he was very much part and parcel of it. He was praying because he knew that he needed to engage in those realities, and he wanted to do so in a way that did not undermine the authenticity of who he was as a child of God, even when some were seeking to use that to their own advantage. And let's be clear, this was no easy option. For one thing, his commitment and piety made him enemies, and we see that in the story. And again, let's recognize that this wasn't because he was deliberately seeking to do that. You don't get to be in line for the most senior position in an empire by being aloof and disengaged. And he wasn't praying to try and prove a point. He was confronted with a real dilemma, and he could probably see the way in which the king had been trapped and deceived even more than the king himself could. And verse 11 tells us that when the arrest squad arrived at Daniel's house, all set up of course, he was asking God for help. He was seeking God's presence in the realities of his here and now. And let's recognize too that these things did not immediately then get better when he prayed. In fact, you could argue that by praying and seeking God's help, all that Daniel did was to make things worse. Because King Darius is bound by his own decree. And even though it goes against everything the king wants, Daniel's prayers land him in a den of lions. That's what happens eventually. And I think that there is such an important principle for us to grasp in that. Prayer is about so much more than just asking God to make all the things that trouble us go away. And when Daniel was eventually thrown into that pit of lions, he had no idea what would happen next. Was he just to become a martyr who might serve as an example for future generations? It was going to take until the next morning before he would discover whether or not God could actually keep him safe there. And when Daniel was praying, I suspect he wasn't simply asking God to stop up the mouths of the lions, but placing the whole situation into God's hands and committing himself to God's purposes, whatever they might have been. Because that's the way we see Daniel reacting to circumstances throughout the book that bears his name. So yeah, to quote another song that they taught me to sing when I was growing up in Sunday school, I want to invite you to dare to be a Daniel. And by that, I don't mean leaping into the nearest lion's den as some form of biblical superhero or going on some great expression of prayer on your balcony, but just staying rooted in God in the face of your own circumstances. So as ever, please don't just watch this video, but find some time and space to reflect on this story on your own. And if you can, share in this with at least one other person. And maybe begin by reflecting again on Daniel's daily rhythm of praying towards Jerusalem. And I'm not suggesting that you particularly need to do exactly the same, but maybe just ask yourself, what rhythms and routines do I need to establish in order to maintain my own faith in these new circumstances? If some of those familiar traditional routines have been taken from us, then let's find new ones within our own life circumstances now. And let's also think, what is the purpose of those routines? As I said earlier, I don't think Daniel was just trying to recreate what he'd once had, but to regularly each day recenter his life on what his faith taught him. Facing Jerusalem was a symbol of a bigger reality. And for all that he rubbed shoulders every day with some of the most senior officials in the world at the time, he never lost sight of the fact that God was ruler and king over all. So how can you remind yourself of that every day? How can you let that define your experiences at the moment? And from that place of recognizing God's rule and God's reign, perhaps the natural question to then consider is, what are the realities that you're having to face at the moment? And remember again, what brought Daniel to that place of prayer was that he was utterly engaged in the affairs of state. The problems that the nation was facing were his problems. The issues that needed to be addressed were his issues. And again, as I said earlier, he didn't pray to escape those issues. He prayed to bring God into the center of them. So whether it's your family life or your own personal struggles or the needs of your community or those big issues that are echoing around the world at the moment, how can you bring God into the center of your experience of them? And then, I'd invite you to recognize that for Daniel, things got worse before they got better. So perhaps as we pray, we need to simply reaffirm our faith and our trust in God, and to find strength not in simply expecting that God will change every circumstance, though at times this can happen, but that God's unchanging rule and presence can be found in every situation that comes our way, even if our immediate experience is that things get worse. Now, that doesn't mean that things aren't going to be tough, but God never promised us constant stability or a life free from disruption. These are things that we've just got used to through our own circumstances. What God has promised is that whatever happens, he will never change and he will still be there. Thanks for listening.